James is Vice President for External Relations and Senior Fellow for Environment and Energy Policy at Heartland Institute. He's Managing Editor of Environment and Climate News, a national monthly publication devoted to sound science and free market environmentalism. And I'll bet if you asked him really nicely, you could probably get a subscription to the Energy and Science News. Environment and Climate News, I'm on their list, and I know the Crawfords are also on their list. So anytime something really good appears, they get in touch with me and say, "Did you see that?" Taylor writes a weekly column for Forbes, which appears on Forbes.com. He's presented energy and environmental analysis on CNN, Headline News, CNN, Fox News Channel, Fox Business Channel, MSNBC, PBS, NewsHour, Frontline, CBS Evening News, ABC, World News, and other TV and radio outlets across the country. And he's been presented at the National Conference of State Legislators, as well as the supposedly evil ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, the Council of State Governments, National Association of Counties, and State Policy Network, which Rio Grande Foundation is a member of. So, with that, James received his bachelor's from Dartmouth College. He studied atmospheric science and majored in government. He received his Juris Doctorate from Syracuse University. So please welcome James Taylor.
All right, well, thank you, Paul, for the very kind introduction. Thank you also. I know it's 6 o'clock in the evening after a long day of work or running errands or even just tending to the day-to-day activities of life. I know it's a sacrifice to come here, so thank you so much, each and every one of you who are giving up part of your evening. And also, this gentleman here says if you don't have a microphone, speak up. So I'm going to do my best to speak up. This Korean veteran to whom I owe much of my freedom today, that's the least I can do. Thank you for serving back. Boy, my wife's father was in the Korean War, and some of the stories are just heartbreaking, so thank you so much.
Was he Army or Marine?
He was in the Marines. Yeah, and my father was in the Army, but that was just after World War II. So, anyway, thank you so much. And Paul mentioned the salt story, and it reminds me, I'll just digress a little bit off this topic, but it's kind of related because it's nuclear power and energy related. We remember Fukushima a couple of years ago, and every time you hear this in the media, it's the nuclear power disaster at Fukushima. It's the nuclear disaster. It's, they use the terms or whatever, it'll bounce around a little, but it's always giving the impression that this is a reason why we need to get away from nuclear power. So the question is this: does anybody in this room know the exact number, if not I'll give it to you, of people who died as a result of the nuclear power meltdown? Zero. And I say meltdown, well, the facilities that were damaged, about as much of a meltdown as you're going to get in today's day and age. Zero. The number of people who were made seriously ill. Zero. The number of people who died in the earthquake and tsunami.
230,000.
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but it's up there. I know it's at least in the tens of thousands. And yet you have people saying that this is why we cannot have nuclear power. We had a once-in-a-generation earthquake, a once-in-a-generation tsunami that was right there, hit where you had a nuclear power facility, hit it as hard as one can hit it, and there were absolutely no human health detriments. In fact, what we also know from Chernobyl, which if you go back a generation, with the horrendous Soviet lack of safeguards, when you look at Chernobyl, the United Nations reports that less than 100 people, I believe it's less than 50 people, it's right about 50 died as a result of Chernobyl. Those are the people who went right in as it was occurring. It wasn't people afterwards affected by radiation. In fact, what we know is that people who were close to Chernobyl and were exposed to that elevated level of radiation have lower cancer rates, have lower health problems across the board for many things that would be tied to radiation. The concept is hormesis. You reach a certain level and radiation is very harmful, very deadly, but that level's very high. And what the EPA sets for the background radiation that we can be exposed to is like 1,000 times less than that. I'm throwing the number out, but it's well beneath that. And in fact, where we have more radiation is where people have lower cancer risk. And it reminded me of that hearing the news about salt. Oh, we hear about how horrible salt is. The dose makes the poison for pretty much everything that you're exposed to. And until you reach that level, and EPA sets levels for whatever whatever that they are regulating, they set them in and I use the number 1,000 for the radiation because EPA sets for most of their environmental health rules. That's the level. It has to be 1,000 times less than what they consider actually to be dangerous through tests and field trials, etc. So when people throw out some scare, whether it's saccharin in diet beverages or whatever it is, if EPA allows it in any way, shape, or form, believe me, it's not going to harm you. If it was even close to harming you, they would have gotten rid of it by now. So anyway, that's just a side note, but it is energy related, so I guess that's okay. What I'm going to talk about today, and Paul touched on this, the renewable power mandates. By the way, I never use the term renewable portfolio standards. That's the term that those who are supporting the big government interventionism on behalf of expensive renewable power, they use renewable portfolio standards because they don't want people to understand that it's a mandate. Well, look at the terms. Okay, renewable, that's common. Renewable power mandate, renewable portfolio standard. Why do they choose portfolio? Well, you think of a portfolio as what you invest in for your stocks. It's an investment. It's something that's going to give all these economic dividends. That's why they say portfolio. Standard, not mandate, standard. Well, standard is something you aspire to reach. It's not something you are forced to obey. The correct term is renewable power mandates. And I have to beat people in the Heartland office all the time for that too. Don't ever say that. I know that's what they call it in the bill. Of course, Paul uses that term because that's a technical term in the New Mexico legislation. However, I'm not going to let them get away with it. So anyway, how is affordable energy threatened in New Mexico? The New Mexico House, as Paul mentioned, did a fantastic job on many issues this year. One of the things they did is they passed legislation that would have frozen in place, not repeal, not even roll back, but freezing in place the current renewable power mandates in New Mexico. As it stands right now, 8% of New Mexico's electricity generation comes from renewable sources. If you go back prior to 2007, it was essentially 0%. So they've ramped it up to 8%. By 2020, current law says that it has to be 20%. So legislation said, look, we've got to 8%, and I'm going to show you the economic consequences and the lack of environmental benefits. The House said, look, that's good enough. Let's keep it here. And the Senate, unfortunately, killed that. So you're still going to have a ramping up 2.5 times as much as what you've already seen. And when I show you the economic impacts, expect more of that in the future. So that's how affordable energy is threatened in New Mexico, most particularly. There are other issues and topics we can dwell upon, but this is the central one and what I'll be addressing today. So let's take a look at New Mexico's renewable power mandate. Okay, in 2007, as I mentioned, 20% for the public utilities, 10% for rural co-ops. The rural co-ops are just a small percentage of electricity generation, so essentially what it means is an 18% renewable power mandate for the state. And as I mentioned before, 8% currently comes from renewable power. It's really funny when you talk when this issue was presented in the New Mexico legislature, and when it's been debated in other states, and I go there and testify and present information on that. The renewable power folks, the environmental activists, they always say, well, look, we now are generating 8% of our power from renewable sources. Therefore, it's a success. Look how successful it's been. You don't measure success on whether you meet the mandate that government puts a gun to your head and says you have to meet it. The success or failure is determined by what are the economic and environmental consequences. When they sold us this bill of goods, what did they promise and what has been delivered? So, here were the promises. First of all, environmental benefits. That was all the rage back in the mid-2000s. We were going to reduce emissions. And when they talked about environmental benefits, that was 90% of the ball game. Pollutants, emissions from power plants. That was the first and foremost message. In the years since, they have lost steam and momentum, and sound science has turned their arguments on their heads. So they've gone to number 2, which is economic benefits. Look at all the jobs that will be created. If we're going to have wind turbines put into place on this mesa, if we're going to have solar panels and equipment there, it's going to create jobs, people who build them, people who operate them, etc. The economic benefits. We'll talk about the realities of that also. And now, a little bit more recently, they talk about energy independence and national security. Well, this way we're not dependent on these people from the Middle East, forgetting for the moment that oil is a transportation fuel. Wind and solar power do not power automobiles or semi-trucks. It's electricity. Electricity is coal and natural gas, nuclear, which are all domestic. But anyway, we'll talk about some of the arguments about energy independence, and national security as well. So let's address these one by one and look at the specifics as to what was promised and then what the results have been. Here we have, remember, for environmental issues, it was all about emissions, all about pollutants. This is from EPA, the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The environmental activists, they always say that I'm just making stuff up or cherry picking. Well, if I'm cherry picking the EPA. What else do they want me to cite? This is an EPA chart. They are tracking their 6 principal pollutants. These are the 6 pollutants that are most important in EPA's consideration regarding human health concerns. It's that green line at the bottom that is the 6 principal pollutants. Since 1980, according to EPA, actually I won't say since, from 1980 to 2010, and we'll talk about the last 5 years in a moment. From 1980 to 2010, according to EPA, the federal government, this was produced in 2011 for 2010 data, according to the Obama administration's EPA, pollutants, emissions have declined by 67%. Think back to 1980. I'm not talking 1950, 60, 70. I'm talking 1980, 10 years after the Clean Air Act was passed, etc. In 1980, I was 13 years old, so granted, I didn't have quite the adulthood maturity yet. I don't recall wheezing and coughing and dying in the streets. I imagine there were places that were pretty difficult, Los Angeles, Houston, but by and large, if someone were to say back in 1980, I'll tell you what, in 35 years, we're going to reduce emissions by half. If someone were to say that to you, you'd say, wow, that's incredible. I mean, I can't imagine that. I'm not even sure if it's necessary. It'd be nice to cut it down some, but half? No. 2/3. 2/3. So when we look at this data, these numbers, it shows us that we have already achieved most, perhaps all, and then some of what we hope to accomplish in reducing power plant emissions. And it begs the question, what is the price of chasing down the last single molecule of emissions? I mean, the cleaner the air, the better. But of course, if it costs money, if it takes resources away from education, healthcare, housing, you name it, other environmental issues, well, you have to weigh if it's really worth it. We've knocked down 2/3 of the emissions since 1980. Now, this is real interesting. This is why I mentioned 2010 rather than since. Notice how this chart goes to 2013. This is EPA, same chart they produce. In 2010, they reported that emissions had declined 67% since 1980. Now they go and revise, and after 3 years, notice from 2010 to 2013, they show that emissions are still declining, and yet now they say it's only 62% reduction. This reminds me of the global warming debate. Every year, they go back and they retroactively lower temperatures in the first half of the 20th century, and then for present temperatures, they make adjustments that say they're higher than the thermometers read. Even though you and I know that if you stick a thermometer at ABQ, which is where many of the temperature stations are at airports and places like that, because of the city gaining population, temperatures are going to be higher artificially than they are in the region. But yet, the global warming folks, they raise the temperatures above that. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting that EPA now 3 years later is claiming that we didn't get quite as clean as they said we did, and yet it's the same data. But either way, 67%, 62%, if the name of the game is reducing emissions, we've already come a very, very, very far way. It's not to say that there's no benefit in reducing further, but keep that in mind when we compare different forms of environmental problems, challenges, benefits, and costs. I'm going to take questions at the end, but you did have your hand up, so I'll make the one exception.
Well, you talk about how maybe the data is corrupted by having things like the Albuquerque airport, which you get warms up because of all the concrete and that sort of thing. And that's something that Richard Muller looked into quite carefully. And he did that while working at Berkeley with money that he was able to get donated, I think, to do that study. And when he finished the study, his results plot right on top of what had been collected by the science community previously. And he no longer contests this idea about the data because he's done it himself, and he's no longer a denier.
So, Richard Muller, by the way, I've conversed with him. I like Richard as a person, so I don't mean this in any way to be disparaging his character. Richard Muller was never you used the word denier, thank you very much, I take pride in that term. Richard Muller was never a denier, although he professed that he was in Wall Street Journal articles, etc. After he made his claims and reported his data and said that I used to be a skeptic, well, I used to be, I think he used the term skeptic, you used the term denier. Now I'm not. Because of this, I went back and found quotes to him back to the 1980s, where he has been very much on board the alarmist camp. His findings are contradicted by the USCRN, which is a network of over 100 temperature stations that NOAA put into place a decade ago. They find that they made it a point to put them in places that are not corrupted by expanding metropolitan regions, etc. Very pristine locations, and what they found is that that's spread throughout the United States. We're in a 10-year cooling trend. What I would like to see happen for the money that we spend on all these $20 billion that we've spent federal government on global warming programs, which is basically, when I say programs, paying people who have already come out and said they support global warming alarmism, giving them more money to write new papers. I'd rather see us invest that money to have a USCRN network around the globe, because the satellite data also show that temperatures are not rising. But anyway, that's a side point for now. We could talk about it more in Q&A if you like. But anyway, but you see how EPA has changed the data. They didn't give an explanation. Either way, we're doing a pretty good job there. But let's take a look at specifics now. Wind power. Let's compare basically by shutting down coal in particular. Natural gas, by the way, reduces the 6 principal pollutants versus coal by 90+%, all 6. So you can have an emissions-free power source from natural gas, which is much less expensive than wind and solar, but the preferred alternatives to cut emissions are going to be wind and solar. So let's take a look at wind power. Here are some facts about wind power that go beyond just emissions, because environmental concerns are not just emissions. I mean, what's the reason for the opposition to, for example, pipelines in Alaska? It's not emissions, it's because they talk about having landscapes that are disrupted, etc. So wind power. According to the American Wind Energy Association's own data on the amount of space that's required for wind turbines, the amount of electricity that it produces, it requires 600 square miles of wind turbines to replace a single conventional power plant. So yes, if you go to wind power, you're going to have fewer emissions. We can go beneath that 67%. But at the same time, if you're a conservationist, if you like open spaces, I do. Whenever I travel, I love to go out and see the lay of the land, get the viewscapes, go hiking, walking. I appreciate not having them disrupted. Every time that we replace a single conventional power plant with the equivalent energy from wind turbines, it's going to take 600 square miles of development. That, by the way, does not factor in transmission lines. The wind turbines tend to be in remote places. The places that are best suited for wind turbines are mountaintop ridges, coastal shorelines, and open plains, none of which, maybe with some exception to coastal shorelines, none of which are connected very closely or in regional proximity to where you're going to have the wind turbine farms. And in fact, even though many cities are on coastal shorelines, you don't have the wind turbine farms right there because you have air traffic and other concerns. So the transmission lines are an additional development factor that you have to consider. Now, wind only powers 3% of the nation's electricity. Yet keep in mind, with such a small amount of electricity, wind power kills 1.4 million birds and bats each and every year. That is another significant environmental negative impact. Land development, animal destruction. You have to factor that in if we're going to talk about emissions as well. That's with only 3% of electricity generated. If we were to ramp up to 30%, which would only be a small amount compared to what the folks who want to completely eliminate or cut carbon dioxide by 80%, 30% wouldn't even take us halfway there. But let's say we ramped it up to 30%. Now you're talking 1.4 million birds times 10, and we can look at the intricacies, whether it be a little more or a little less, but you'd be looking at 14 million birds and bats each and every year. Let's compare that. Oh, and by the way, my second bullet point here, oil and natural gas prosecutions, wind farms get a free pass. If by chance, and this does happen occasionally, let's say that you have an oil or natural gas producer, and they have the water retention ponds, and they have to go through all sorts of efforts covering with tarps and having all sorts of things to prevent wildlife, birds from getting in there in case they get trapped in there, or if the water ponds have any oil or anything that could do damage to them. When you get an occasional bird that gets in there, gets trapped and dies, they face fines in the millions for just a handful of birds. Yet wind turbines can kill 1.4 million each and every year and get a free pass. If the federal government really values a handful of birds at a few $1 million, we have to apply that to wind power. and multiply $1.4 million, or 1.4 million birds and bats, times the millions of dollars. And that tells you whether, from the federal government's own numbers, it's worthwhile environmentally to switch to wind. Now, the third bullet point there in this row, compared to the BP Gulf oil spill. If you remember, when we had the wellhead blowout in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, and we had the uncontrolled release of oil for, what was the time period, a couple months, President Obama, very soon after it happened, said, this is why we need to get off of coal, oil, natural gas, whatever, and have more wind turbines, have more wind power. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, after the wellhead was capped, they did a survey. They looked at the total number of marine birds, marine mammals, marine reptiles that were killed together throughout the entirety of that oil spill wellhead blowout. The number was roughly 6,500. A once-in-a-generation wellhead blowout killed 6,500, and to which the President of the United States says, this shows us why we need to do this other thing which kills 1.4 million each and every year. Doesn't make any sense to me. By the way, just as a side note, there's a company in Houston, the Helix Corporation, within a year or two after the wellhead blowout, they developed a platform that can be transported to anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico within 48 hours, and that would cap a wellhead blowout up to twice the severity of the BP Gulf oil spill. So for all intents and purposes, the BP Gulf oil spill cannot occur today, at least not more than 24 to 48 hours worth of oil spilling out. And yet we're told that's a reason why we need to have more of the 1.4 million bird and bat killers, even with just a little bit of electricity. One final note on wind power. Rare earths are necessary for wind turbine and the equipment, or excuse me, the electronics and the turbines themselves that run them. And this is something that's often overlooked in terms of environmental consequences. Yale University Environment 360 report. They reported, quote, contrary to their name, the 17 rare earth elements are relatively common. Their rarity comes from the labor involved in separating them from surrounding rock. The process requires a cocktail of chemical compounds and produces a tremendous amount of solid waste, according to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So when we are going to go to wind power, then we're going to have those additional environmental negative impacts. The same report continues. Last year, China's State Council, because China is where most of the rare earths are being mined, it's where most of the equipment for solar power, wind power are being manufactured. Last year, China's State Council reported that the country's rare earths operations are causing, quote, increasingly significant environmental problems. A half-century of rare earths mining and processing has severely damaged surface vegetation, caused soil erosion, pollution, and acidification, and reduced or even eliminated food crop output, the council reported, adding that Chinese rare earth plants typically produce wastewater with a high concentration of radioactive residues. So what we see is that in our zeal to further cut down emissions, which are already pretty low compared to where they were 30 years ago, we are going to have more bird and bat deaths, we're going to have more land development, less land conservation, we're going to have more environmental damage from the mining of rare earths for the wind turbines. What about solar power? Some environmental impacts of solar power. Not quite as bad as wind power in terms of land development, but still it's land intensive. It takes typically 40 square miles of solar equipment to replace a single conventional power plant. Again, that's a significant amount of unnecessary land development. And where these solar facilities are located is typically an undisturbed desert. These are areas where you have desert tortoises and other desert species that are being kicked out. It's not like they're just, adding it next to some shopping center or some suburban mall. It's an undisturbed, highly ecologically valuable desert. The second bullet point, some of you may have seen this in the news a few months ago, the Bright Source Ivanpah project in the Mojave Desert. This is supposed to be the new generation technology for solar power. They have a field of mirrors, a huge field of mirrors. They shine into one large tower, which then has the, heats up the water, turns the turbines, etc. Those mirrors are singeing. First of all, they're attracting birds because from the sky it looks like water. You have the reflections off the mirrors. So you have birds, many migratory birds, they're swooping in low, they think it's water, they get singed and killed in mid-flight by the thousands in just this one place, this one facility. And again, you don't hear the environmental uproar. You have to read the literature to find it. And they're not getting penalized the way oil, natural gas producers would be if they killed even a fraction of that number. That's another very significant environmental detriment to solar power. If you have solar thermal power, there's solar photovoltaic, you have the mirrors, you have solar thermal. Solar thermal is the least expensive. It's still far more expensive than conventional energy. But if you use solar thermal in an effort to make it merely 3, 4, or 5 times as expensive as conventional energy, that is extremely water intensive. It requires twice as much water as generating electricity from coal, 4 times as much water as generating electricity from natural gas. And of course, solar power is most efficient where you have cloudless skies. The closer to the equator, the better. In other words, arid deserts where water is most valuable and most ecologically troubling to displace and attempt to replace. So there's another environmental consequence. If we're going to talk about the environmental detriments of conventional energy, we have to look at the whole universe of environmental pluses and minuses. There is no such thing as environmentally benign energy technology. And by the way, the same rare earth problems with wind turbines apply to solar technology, in fact even more so, so you have the same study showing that that's another factor we should consider. Now I'm talking mostly about electricity today, but I did want to mention gasoline and ethanol because oftentimes you have environmental activist groups that are pushing ethanol. Not so much anymore because the science, they're finally acknowledging the science has been building up for years that people like me have been saying, but nevertheless, just in case you hear this, first of all, it requires 3.1 gallons of water to produce a single gallon of ethanol. That has environmental consequences. Moreover, that's just the production process. That's not even talking the irrigation that has to occur to grow the crops. And in fact, much of the corn crop that we're getting for ethanol production is in marginal cropland, land that would not be used to produce crops but for the ethanol mandates and subsidies, so they require even more irrigation than would be the case otherwise. So it's very difficult on water supplies. It encourages the development of marginal cropland. In other words, cropland that would be left in its natural state is now being developed. Again, if you're a conservationist like me, that's troubling. Third, it does nothing for global warming if you believe that's a concern. I do not believe global warming is a serious concern. I'd be happy to take questions about that in Q&A. But even if you believe it is, ethanol is carbon dioxide neutral compared to gasoline. While there are some pollutants that ethanol reduces vis-a-vis gasoline, there are many others that it increases. It's essentially a push in terms of emissions. And finally, talking again about land use, land development, currently 40% of our corn crop, 40%, that's almost half, is getting diverted to ethanol, and it's producing only 10% of our gasoline. I mean, if we could say, all right, let's divert 10% of the corn crop and get 40% of our transportation, well, that might make sense. But 40% of our corn crop to 10% of our transportation fuel, it's not a solution. It might make a small dent at a substantial price, including, of course, raising food costs because you're no longer having the supply of food you otherwise would have. But it is not something that is going to be a cure for gasoline. So the point here, when we examine the different types of energy resources and environmental impacts, is that there is no such thing as a free lunch. They all have environmental consequences, and what you consider to be important in many cases is going to be according to your subjective preferences. For me, I think it's more important to preserve some of the open spaces we have, the beautiful vistas that we have, preserve our wildlife. I think that's a little more important than a marginal reduction of emissions that have already been reduced dramatically. Others might disagree, they're entitled to do that, but it's important to know the facts when you make that decision for yourself. And here's one final note regarding subjective priorities and interpretations and valuations of environmental issues. This was in 2008, as you can see by the script here on my personal camera. I was in Denver for some meeting, and I decided to drive out to the Rowan Plateau, northwestern Colorado, where they had a great deal of natural gas production, some oil production, more so now than back then. But anyway, at the time, there was all this outrage that you were despoiling the Rocky Mountains, despoiling the mountain landscapes. Well, the Rowan Plateau is not the Rocky Mountains, as you can see. But even so, let's take a look at how badly this oil and natural gas production is destroying the natural lay of the land. Here on the left, I drove into an area that's an active oil and natural gas production field, again in the epicenter. This is where you have the most intense development. Can someone show me the rigs that are producing oil and natural gas? Can you see? Can you point them out? You can't. You have to search. Even when I was there, I know this is a photograph, but even when I was there, I had to get up close and look closely. Here's one right here. And it's the same color, it has a very small footprint, that produces a substantial amount of energy. Got one over here, and I forget there was another two in here. You can barely see them. And what was really funny is after I did this and said, wow, I mean, people are getting upset about this. Oh, and by the way, I came across a gentleman who was driving by the road. He stopped to ask me questions because he's wondering why I'm taking photographs of this energy infrastructure. Turned out he was a local guy, and I said, well, how did the wildlife react to this? He said, well, actually, in the winter in particular, they love it because to the extent you have a little bit of this equipment, they like to get up behind it. It's just a little bit of a windbreak, and even just a little bit makes a big difference when you have 20 below zero and 30-mile-per-hour winds. But anyway, the point being that this is destroying the landscapes and the vistas. I drive down the road 10 miles, and here you had just a little small equipment facility that probably uses just a tick of energy. That's it. And look at all the solar panels required to operate to provide this with the energy. You tell me which is spoiling the landscape more. I think this, and yet it's producing not even 1/100th of the energy that this is producing. Just struck me as odd. All right, now let's talk about economics, because that was the second justification for these renewable power mandates. Solar power. The left of center Brookings Institution. This is not a conservative think tank. It's the Brookings Institution. They are left of center. They published a report late last year. They looked at the various costs of energy sources. What they found is that new solar, and I put new in red because we often hear about, oh, solar power is down 5-fold from the cost it was 10 years ago. Yeah, well, it was up at Mars before, now it's merely at the top of our stratosphere. New solar, with these price drops, are 3 times as expensive as coal and natural gas power. That's from a left-of-center think tank that is generally supportive of renewable power. 3 times the cost. For every increment of solar power that's added to our electricity mix, you are paying triple what you would otherwise be paying. The more we ramp up the percentage of this, the more you're paying 300% of what you need to be paying. Now, if you want to say, well, even if Brookings is left of center, let's go to something more official, happy to do that. The U.S. Energy Information Administration, under the Obama administration, reports that new solar, solar power that's put into place, it becomes operational next year. So with the best technologies available today, and over the 30-year span of their existence, and we'll talk about that in a minute, are still going to be 5 times more expensive than conventional power. That's official federal government, Obama administration statistics. I don't care how much solar power has come down from what it was before. It is still astronomically more expensive than what conventional power is. Now, a few things I note. Pro-solar biases, even this number from the Obama administration, 5 times more expensive. One pro-solar bias is that it assumes, and this applies to wind power as well, it assumes that all facilities have an equal 30-year lifespan. Well, we know that coal and natural gas power plants easily run beyond 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, it's not a problem. So you don't have to be investing every 30 years the incredible investment to construct, to build the facilities themselves. By contrast, solar power, same with wind, you're lucky to get 20 or 25 years. So they're giving a huge advantage to solar power here, saying that you're not going to have to replace the equipment until longer than you really do, and saying you'll have to replace the coal and natural gas power plants before you do. Also, solar power is often of very little utilitarian value. If the sun is shining and there's not much solar power demand, then you don't have much use for it. You have to shrink, you have to reduce your baseload power, which you're already using at a hum at a level pace. You're basically substituting more expensive for less expensive power when you don't really need to do it. Third, solar power forces higher inefficiencies in baseload power. And it's the same for wind power. What happens if you're driving down the highway, if you're driving on I-40 and you're going at 70 miles an hour, you're using a certain amount of gasoline. If you're driving stop and go in downtown Albuquerque, you're not going nearly as fast, but you're using a lot more gasoline because you're ramping up and down. The same principle applies for power plants. So whenever you put solar and wind power on the grid, where it's going to vary minute by minute, if a cloud goes by, if the wind varies, now you have to be doing this, ramping up and down your baseload power generation. These numbers don't even account for the fact that this is going to have a negative impact on the coal and natural gas power plants that are going to make solar power even effectively more expensive. But regardless, let's even take them at their word, 5 times more expensive. So when they say this is an economically valuable thing to do, no, it's not. Now, some people will say, oh, well, if you gave us the subsidies that oil or coal get, well, then, of course, we could sell as much. That's not true either. The U.S. Energy Administration, the Obama administration, reported just last month, solar power receives more preferential subsidies than all conventional energy sources combined. Coal, oil, natural gas. I use the term preferential for a reason, because some of these dolts will say, well, if there is a tax provision that says any industry in the country, energy, non-energy, within energy, natural gas, oil, whatever, can depreciate their equipment at an accelerated rate, well, that's a subsidy. Well, if you don't tax something as much as you otherwise might, I'm not sure that's a subsidy. It's a subsidy if it's put into place for to give a preference to a particular product. If it applies across the board, and the reason why you have oil taking advantage of it more is because they're a larger industry, that's not an oil subsidy. The same applies to solar power, wind power, etc. So when you look at subsidies that are targeted to a specific industry that are by true definition subsidies, solar power receives more than all conventional energy sources combined. Don't let them tell you that they just need to catch up and level the playing field against other energy sources. It's the other way around. And if you weigh that, that's just that's just in raw dollars. But when you consider how little energy solar power produces for all those subsidies, and how much energy we get from conventional power sources without the subsidies, if you weigh that in terms of subsidy per unit of energy produced, you're looking at 25 times more subsidies for solar power now than for all conventional energy sources combined. But doesn't the sun shine for free? I mean, here we have a viewscape in New Mexico. It's sunny quite a bit. The sun shines for free. I was watching hearings in the House, and one of the reps there was like, "Oh, how can you say it's so expensive? The sun shines for free. It's free energy." Well, it's free if I want to sit out here and get a suntan, sure. But to turn that into electricity is a whole different story. The sun may shine for free, but the sun's energy is very diffuse. It's not concentrated like a lump of coal, like what you have in oil. You have to pull together a great deal of it in order to produce even just a little bit of power. And on top of that, you need all the equipment to do so. That's where the costs are. That's why it's so much more expensive. It does not matter. It's irrelevant whether the sun shines for free. How much energy is the sun producing? How much can we capture? How expensive is it? How diffuse is it? I've lived the past 20 years in Florida. I hear that all the time. Well, we're the sunshine state. So why shouldn't we be leading the nation? We should be leading the nation in solar power. We should be promoting it because we're the sunshine state. All right, well, the sun shines for free, but it still makes little sense. And let me give you an example. See this little dude? I was in Manhattan just last month. And I could tell you that rats run around. New York City is a rat capital of the world, and they run around Manhattan for free. So why shouldn't New York City produce rat power? I mean, look, you can put this guy on a treadmill, and you can put up all the equipment, and you could produce electricity. I mean, it's scientifically, it's technologically feasible. And New York City is a rat capital of the world. But there's a reason why they don't do it. Because you have to have millions, billions of these guys running around to even generate a little bit of electricity, and the equipment's so expensive. It does not matter if the sun shines for free. It does not matter if this dude runs around for free. It's how expensive is it to capture it, how difficult is it, how much energy can you produce. Wind power. The economics are much the same regarding solar power. The same Brookings Institution study, left of center think tank, found, well, not quite as expensive as solar power. Solar power is 3 times as expensive as conventional energy. New wind power, again, wind power costs have come down. New wind power, twice as expensive as coal and natural gas. Every increment of wind power in your bill is doubling that increment of your electricity bill. 2 years ago, I was in Ohio testifying about their renewable power mandates. They had a top official from PJM, grid operator. They don't have a dog in this fight. They just operate the grid. That's what they do. But their official was asked in testimony, look, nuts and bolts, when you have to add wind power to the grid, how expensive is it? He said at least double and really probably triple the price of conventional power. There's no dog in the fight. He's the guy who works on it every day. Finally, again, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, under the Obama administration, reports new wind power over the next 30 years will be somewhere between twice as expensive and 3 times as expensive as conventional power. So, maybe the day will come when wind power and solar power are cost competitive with conventional energy. I seriously doubt anyone in this room is going to be alive to see it. It's silly for us to force those added expenses on ourselves when we're not going to get anything back. And quite frankly, I doubt it'll ever be the case because the energy is so diffuse, and to capture it's very expensive. Same thing with wind power subsidies, much like solar power subsidies. Wind power also receives more subsidies than all conventional energy sources combined. I already gave you that. Yeah, same thing. Doesn't the wind blow for free? Well, yeah, and rats run around for free. So do politicians. Good analogy. How does this apply to New Mexico? Let's circle back to our state-specific analysis. In 2007, as Paul pointed out, New Mexico enacted its renewable power mandates. So what happens when you add all this expensive electricity to the grid? We see it in the numbers. We saw it in the macro numbers that apply across the board. We see it in New Mexico. You saw the chart that Paul showed. 2005, 2006, 2007, electricity prices flat, actually falling a little. We put the renewable power mandate into place. We go from 0% to 8% renewable power. Electricity prices have risen 32% since 2007. That is more than twice the national increase. And when I go to Ohio, when I go to North Carolina, when I go to Arkansas, when I go to Colorado, when I go to Kansas, when I go to these states, well, actually Arkansas doesn't have a renewable power mandate. They were debating putting one in. These other states, when I go and testify and provide information about the cost of renewable power mandates, it's always the same. The year that they put in the renewable power mandate, the year that they start mandating more of the renewable power, electricity prices skyrocket. And they always come up with some excuse. Well, so for these other factors that Mr. Taylor's not accounting for. Yet it happens across the board. In fact, when you look at the states as a whole, those states with renewable power mandates, I chose 2008 because 2008 was about the end. Most of the renewable power mandates in the states were put into place between about 2004 and 2008. Since 2008, those states that have renewable power mandates in this country, 30 states, their electricity prices have risen more than double what the nation as a whole has risen. I guess that's all coincidental too. That's what we're paying in New Mexico, 32% higher electricity prices since the renewable power mandates. If electricity prices in New Mexico had risen nearly at the national average, I'm not saying holding flat, I'm saying rising at the national average since 2007. In 2014 alone, the New Mexico economy would have saved $300 million. That's how much that we paid extra in electricity prices just in 2014 because of those higher electricity prices. And if you break that out among New Mexico's 765,000 households, the average household in this state paid just last year alone $400 in extra electricity costs that were unnecessary, unwarranted, and would not have occurred if prices had merely risen at the national average. I think if people were to be aware of that number, I don't care how much you'd like to reduce emissions, even if you forget about all the other environmental factors that argue against wind and solar power, do you really want to pay $400 each and every year to just tangentially lower what's already been reduced so much? Maybe some people do, but I think that's an important number, $400 every year. And that's not even factoring in federal and New Mexico specific subsidies that can give into solar, wind power, etc. That's just the retail prices. You're paying more in your tax dollars to pay for all the subsidies. Now, this is a very important point. It's only going to get worse. We're only at 8% renewable power here in New Mexico. The mandate is 20% by 2020. Electricity growth is occurring at only 1% per year. How do we get 12% increase? Well, across the board it's 10% from 8 to 18, 20% for the utilities. So how do we get to 10% increase in 5 years with only 1% growth in electricity usage? If you had no new coal, no new natural gas, if it was just renewable power, then we'd be up to 13%. But the law, the mandate says 18%. How do you do that? The answer is you dismantle existing, perfectly good, already paid for coal, natural gas power plants, and the Sierra Club and the Environmental Defense Fund and the Natural Resources Defense Council will talk about what a great victory it is and how many jobs you're created. And what's happening is now, not only are you paying more than you would for existing coal, natural gas, you're tearing down perfectly good plants you've already paid for in order to build more at more expensive costs and for more expensive electricity. So it's only going to get worse. If you like your 32% increase since 2007, you're going to love what's coming over the next 5 years. Now, I mentioned how they talk about the green jobs that are created. Whenever they say we are creating jobs, look at all the jobs that are created in the wind power sector, the renewable power sector, I want you to remember this visual, this broken window. Because if the only thing we're worried about is creating jobs, then we should have the federal government, we should have New Mexico, we should petition Governor Martinez to have a program where we're going to hire people to throw stones through windows. I mean, think about that. We would be creating a tremendous number of jobs for every person who we hire to pick up rocks and throw through windows. We would be creating a tremendous amount of jobs in the window repair industry because they'd have a lot of work to do. Well, look at all the jobs we created. But what you miss is the fact that now people have to take a substantial amount of their budget that now that they devote to healthcare, education, housing, clothing, or just the goods and services that make our lives more enjoyable, they have to take that aside and now spend it to keep their windows repaired. Money they don't have to spend now. So yeah, you're creating jobs in the stone throwing industry and the window repair industry, but you are killing jobs throughout the economy because people are not spending money there on things that actually provide them value. Repairing your windows when they're already repaired provides no value. But what you're giving up is a lot of value that you're giving up. So keep that in mind whenever they talk about the jobs created because of this mandate. Some specific examples. In Spain, at King Juan Carlos University, economists studied in Spain their renewable energy programs. They found that sure, green jobs were created, but for every single green power job created, 2.2 jobs were destroyed elsewhere in the economy. In the UK, Verso Economics, same study, they found 3.7 jobs killed for every single green power job created. So I want you to keep this in mind when people say, we created X thousands of jobs through these mandates. Remember that and remember these points. For every 1,000 jobs that they claim they created, first of all, the job numbers they claim are not jobs created, they're merely shifted. If you mandate that a certain percentage of your electricity must come from wind power, you're not creating energy jobs, you're taking energy jobs away from coal and natural gas and giving them to wind. There's the same number of jobs, theoretically. Actually, I'm going to show you in a minute why there's less. But anyway, you're just shifting them, you're not creating them. Second, most of that number they give aren't even jobs that are in the industry. They're jobs that they attribute to, quote, multiplier effects. Oh, well, okay, if you pay somebody $50,000 to build this piece of equipment, he's going to take that $50,000 and spend $30,000 on groceries and $10,000 on gasoline, and that's economic activity creates jobs. And they're going to, it's not really jobs in the wind power industry. And that same multiplier effect applies, first of all, to the natural gas and coal power plant workers, and more importantly, to the wealth that you're stealing and stripping from the economy to make people pay for their now repaired windows. If you want to apply the multiplier effect, you have to apply it to the jobs you are destroying. So for every 1,000 jobs created, 2,200 or 3,700 jobs are destroyed, and the same multiplier effect applies. An important point here also. Wind turbines, solar power. The jobs that are created are very small in number. It's basically manufacturing the equipment. They're not operating power plants. They're just manufacturing equipment. Most of the equipment is not made in the United States and certainly not in New Mexico, whether the equipment's put here or not. They're made in China, they're made in Germany, etc. So we're paying for jobs over there. Now, a power plant, a coal power plant, natural gas power plant, the construction is very labor intensive. Those are local jobs. The operation requires many more workers to operate than it does to operate a wind turbine or a solar power plant. Again, those are local jobs, those are permanent jobs. And on top of that, not only are we creating jobs, but more importantly, we're generating wealth because we're producing more affordable electricity. So when they talk about the jobs that they're providing, that they're creating, it's an illusory number. What they're doing is destroying jobs. I've been talking about electricity, but I just want to give this principle for oil as well, just so you get an idea of how important energy affordability is to our economy, because the same principle applies to electricity. Everything that you do, every product, is going to be energy intensive. The manufacturing, the transportation, the usage, etc. These data come from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the federal government objective source, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Look at the blue line. The blue line here, going back to 1970, even pre-OPEC, these are oil prices. In red, you have the unemployment rate. Notice how, when oil prices go up, very soon thereafter, unemployment goes up. Oil prices go down, unemployment goes down. It is almost perfect correlation going 40 plus years. This is how important it is to have affordable energy. This is how, when we mandate expensive forms of energy, we're going to have economic detriments. Now in New Mexico, it's a real interesting place because this is at the U.S. level. Now in New Mexico, you see that as oil prices have declined, now there's being some layoffs, you're seeing a reduction in oil jobs, and you're hearing people say, well, this is why we shouldn't have oil production. But keep in mind a couple things. When prices are high, when overall the U.S. economy is suffering from extreme unemployment, New Mexico doesn't suffer that nearly as much. New Mexico's unemployment rate topped out at 8.3%, 2 full percentage points below the national average. Now New Mexico's at 6%, which is half a point above. Government interference is often justified in the economy to level out those swings. That's what energy production jobs do. When prices are high, and therefore unemployment as a whole is high, here in New Mexico, you're actually getting the benefits of people paying those higher prices, and you're mitigating the economy-wide detriments. And you may not get quite as much of the boom when prices are down, but overall, you're leveling that playing field somewhat. Moreover, why did oil prices fall so much during the past year? Economists across the board are in agreement, there's no dispute. It's because of the increase in U.S. production due to new finds and fracking technologies. Now, in states like North Dakota and Texas, which produce even more than New Mexico, their unemployment numbers aren't, New Mexico's unemployment numbers, by the way, are still dropping. It's just the oil industry suffering some. They're not suffering nearly as much in their oil industry. Why not? Because there, the vast majority of the land is owned by the people and the state government. Here in New Mexico, the federal government owns close to 40% of the land, including much of the land with the best oil and natural gas resources. Here in the southeastern corner of the state, northwestern corner. If the federal government would allow New Mexico to produce oil and natural gas at the pace you see in Texas and North Dakota, where the federal government doesn't own the land, yes, prices may be lower, but production would be higher, and you'd basically have a push. So even that really isn't so much an argument against oil production, it's an argument against the federal government stifling oil production in New Mexico relative to other states. One final point, and then I'm going to take as many questions as you like. Energy independence and national security, it only warrants one slide because it's a silly argument. First of all, in terms of renewable power mandates, that's electricity. Electricity is coal, natural gas. The United States has more than a surplus in each. We have more, actually, even if you want to factor in oil, we have more coal, oil, and natural gas than every other nation on Earth. In fact, we have more than double every nation on the Earth with the exception of Russia. We have more than Russia, but they have more than half. They're the only nation on Earth that has as much as half of the energy resources we have. But particular to electricity, coal and natural gas, that's not foreign. There's nothing about energy independence or national security that's being threatened by utilizing domestic sources. As I pointed out earlier, the rare earths that are mined for wind turbines and solar equipment, the manufacturing itself, that's overseas. If you want to talk about vulnerabilities to other nations, and hostile nations in particular, then you're looking at solar power and wind power, not coal and natural gas. Finally, and most importantly of all, the most important factor to being able to raise and sustain a strong military is economic strength. That's what's most important of all. Do you have an economy that can sustain a large military without bankrupting your society? And the key to economic strength is energy prices. It's part of everything we do. Whenever we mandate expensive wind, expensive solar, to the detriment of affordable energy, that is what's jeopardizing our military and our national security and our energy independence. So they make a lot of good surface arguments, but when you look beneath the surface level, you'll see that actually if you do value energy independence and national security, then we should be repealing these renewable power mandates. That is my presentation. You have my email address now. Feel free to email me with any questions that you have. If you'd like a copy of these slides, I'll email them to you. I put a stack of my business cards right there. That also has my cell phone number, contact information. Take as many as you like. Thank you so much for giving up your evening. Thank you so much for fighting for our freedom. Appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I want my beer cold 24/7. So when the wind doesn't blow, that doesn't serve my needs. When the sun doesn't shine, that doesn't serve my needs. Your numbers up there of 2, 3, 4, 5 times the cost of conventional power.
Not my numbers, federal government.
Backup? Does that include the necessary backup for those renewables
It
to
does
produce
not.
24/7 and keep my beer cold?
Yep, that's a great question, and that's why I had 3 subpoints. I actually have on a different PowerPoint, when time is more available to focus specifically on this issue, there are about 10 subpoints, and that's another one that you mentioned, the backup that you need, because what happens, it's not just generating the coal and natural gas power to supplement wind and solar, as you point out. You have to plan for, at least have the ability to produce 100% power from conventional sources, no matter how much wind and solar you have, because the wind may not be blowing, the sun may not be shining. You have to have people at the plant, you have to keep the facilities idling, still spinning, just not actually producing the power, because otherwise it's even more uneconomical and problematic to start and stop. That's another cost factor that you point out that they do not factor into their data. But again, even if we just take them at all their solar and wind preferences they put in there, you're still talking 2, 3, 5 times the cost of conventional power. Great question. Yes, sir.
Recently, a number of industry representatives of solar and wind and ethanol have made the claim that they have passed the return on energy investment in energy, in terms of energy. I'm not sure if I make that clear. Let me repeat myself. When you manufacture and construct a wind or thermal or solar facility, it takes a huge amount of energy. And when you build, let's say, a windmill, it takes concrete in the ground, you gotta hold the thing up, it takes iron, it takes plastic, it takes covering, it takes neodymium, which you mentioned earlier, which is very energy consumptive in order to process.
Right.
It takes so much energy that when you look at the payback you get on the energy from the wind machine you created, it will never be equal to the amount of energy you had to put in it. In other words, you had to burn more coal in terms of BTU than you'll ever get back.
Yeah, and then that's a concept that certainly applies. I'm not familiar off the top of my head with the specific numbers for wind and solar, but I am with algae, because I was looking into this earlier this month, because there's a friend of mine that said, all this with algae, and this is a way to replace oil, and the only reason why we're not doing this is because the big corporations are keeping it down. Well, the biggest investors in algae are the oil companies. I mean, if someone's going to beat them to the punch, they want to beat themselves to the punch. But the U.S. Department of Energy, again, this isn't a right-wing think tank or the oil industry, this is the Obama administration, just published a study on this topic, and what they found all sorts of problems, environmental problems with algae in terms of water usage, toxics, etc. But they also found that the amount of energy that you get out of algae is at best 30% of what it requires to actually produce the power in the first place. So you're reducing by 2/3 the energy in order to produce energy. And that same principle would apply to the construction of wind and solar power equipment.
In 1995, about 1995, Sandia did a study on various types of energy. And they came to the same conclusion that they did on the algae, that it took more energy to produce it than you got back. So these weren't really renewable. These were non-renewable because you didn't get enough energy to renew the plant.
Right.
So there's no such thing as renewable right now. So that report is still out there somewhere. I went to the colloquium, and a U.S. senator had seen the report and banned it from being distributed. I don't have to tell you in New Mexico what party he was probably in. But I have never seen the report, but it is around if you can get your hand on it. And it's a very thorough study. It's been updated some from time to time by somebody, I understand. But the energy, for example, the photovoltaic companies are saying they now have a new process, and they have now passed break even. Well, I looked at their data, and what they did was they dropped out the figure that the amount of energy that's required to purify silicon to the extent you need to purify it to make a photovoltaic device. They just threw that figure out, and they don't use it anymore. The wind energy people came along, and I contacted them, and they said, well, we really passed break even, because now we have new high efficient generators. I asked them about that, and they said, well, we put neodymium magnets in. get neodymium, and they said they'd get back to me.
I'm sure they will
And
tomorrow.
I talked to your algae people also.
All right.
They got some results.
You had a hand up?
Yeah, I have a lot of comments.
Questions are better than comments, but you can weave comments into the question.
Well, yeah, I'll work it around, considering we're in the law library, I'll rephrase it for the jury. I guess one of my primary questions is, what would your recommendation be politically to try to shift the inertia that we have in this whole arena? Because to me, there's so many forces that have gotten behind this, and the public is so brainwashed by all the buzzwords and everything else that they buy it. And I mean, just the fact it's costing the average homeowner in New Mexico $400 more a year, they don't know that. You know?
I try not to make political recommendations. We're a think tank. We deal with policy and information. But I will observe that, take the global warming issue. If,
Do I have to?
no, take it away from me. If this were 30 years ago, the only information people would have, ABC, CBS, NBC Evening News, New York Times, you would not have the public understanding and opposing the alarmist claims like they do, because they'd have no information to access. Now we have the internet. You can look at the studies. Now we have, cable television news shows, and you can get whatever perspective you want or try and get down the middle, but people can bring out the facts. And our websites, we have one at the Heartland Institute, others do as well. And we see this in 2007 when Al Gore produced his movie. And it's really funny, and I don't say this facetiously or exaggerating, because I took a look at every single significant claim he made, and I wrote a paper on it. Every single one was wrong. Every single significant claim that he tried to make based on science, even down to, he had a point where he said, well, here on the farm in Carthage, Tennessee, of course failing to mention it's a tobacco farm that made his family rich. Here on the farm in Tennessee, you can see the change, in temperatures. So I looked up, there are 3 National Climatic Data Center temperature stations near Carthage, Tennessee. In fact, they triangulate around it. And I guess technically, this is where he was most close to being accurate in any of his assertions in the movie. Yes, technically you can see the change, because temperatures have declined in Carthage, Tennessee over the past 50 years. But he tells you in the movie it's warming. But the point being, we have information available. We saw in 2007 that 70% of the public were buying into global warming. If I went in to talk to legislators, Republican legislators, they didn't want to give me the time of day. They thought that if they were to talk about the science and question the science, they would lose credibility on all the other issues. But because we have forums like this, because we have the websites we have, and that Rio Grande has, and that you can find elsewhere, the data, I believe that the truth will always prevail. I believe that if you write your letters to the editor, you talk to your neighbors, eventually it may take a little time, and it may feel like you're not winning because the media won't let you believe you're winning. They'll report that you're losing. But if you look at the recent poll numbers, the poll numbers have been in place for years, there's a reason why a Democratic-controlled House and a Democratic-controlled Senate refused to pass the carbon dioxide restrictions that the Obama administration wanted back in 2009. Yes, sir, in the back.
On the global warming issue, we're now reading that we're coming into a period of substantial cooling. Is that correct?
My own personal speculation, and let me emphasize speculation, there are so many factors involved. If anyone says they know what's going to happen, then I know that they are full of it. They are full of themselves. Based upon solar cycles that we were in, based upon the ocean cycles, actually we're probably about to flip from a cool period in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation to a warm period. You put all these factors together, here's the deal. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. You add more to the atmosphere, you're going to get some warming. The issue in the global warming debate, the issue that divides skeptics and alarmists, is not whether temperatures are warmer or humans are causing some of it. The issues are, what is the context of current temperatures? Are they really unusually hot? The answer is no. What's the pace of our current and foreseeable warming? Is it going to be significant, or significant's not the best word, is it going to be rapid? I believe the answer is no. The science seems pretty clear. What are the consequences? Are we going to have more extreme weather events, droughts, floods, tornadoes, whatever? Well, we know that throughout history, warmer periods have always been more beneficial to human health and welfare than cooler periods. all that in mind, looking at the factors such as, and particularly the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and the fact we're adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. If you want to look at a period of the next 50 years, if I had to put a number on it, I would say expect 0.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Now, you can say, the people say, well, look, this is the hottest year on record. It's because they defined the term, quote, on record to mean over the last 100 years, since we've had a worldwide network of thermometer temperature stations. But we know, if you go back over the past 10,000 years, since the last ice age epoch ended, the period when human civilization first developed, thrived, and flourished with much less technology than we have today, we know the temperatures for the vast majority of that time were significantly warmer than today. So saying that they're the hottest on record, it's a grand experiment, is deceptive. I expect some warming. The present plateau, temperatures have plateaued for 17 years. I expect that's going to end soon. And I think people who emphasize that too much and say it's stopped are going to put themselves in a difficult position when most likely temperatures begin their modest rise, resume their modest rise, which occurred during the 20th century, which really was not a crisis and not a cause for serious concern. But I could be wrong. Temperatures could cool. I know there are some scientists I know who have tremendous credentials, very knowledgeable, who think they will. I know many scientists are very knowledgeable, think they're going to warm pretty significantly. We'll see. In the purple shirt, I know you've had your hand up for a while, and I'll get back to you in the back.
I had a couple of questions on two areas, and I kind of like to get it down to a household, just the individual. We were talking about individual costs going up. One of my neighbors probably drives one of these Nissan Leaf. It's got a little flip cap in the front. You plug an electric line into it. I don't know how efficient that is, but what I've heard is that it takes more to recharge that thing with either conventional or whatever kind of power you got than it would if you would just fill it with gas. Now, the other question I had was regarding solar. One of my neighbors was approached by we're getting deluged now in Albuquerque with Solar City and a number of others. Our senator announced Solar City would come up. My neighbor, who's a much more technical guy than I am, he just retired from the Air Force, he said they tried to sell him a system for his house that would add about $45,000 cost to him, amortized in like a 20 or 30 year mortgage, which he said the system, as far as he's concerned, isn't worth more than $5,000. They're selling it to him for $45,000. I don't know how he knows about the 5,000 versus the 45, but the whole idea of tacking this thing onto his house, I think it's going to lock in guarantee his electric bill is to be 20% less or 10% less or something like that, or lock in a certain rate for these 20 years.
Okay.
Now, he thinks that for one thing, the technology, if it's going to improve, in 20 years, maybe in 5 or 10 years, that thing will be outmoded.
Yeah.
It won't take the whole roof, of his house to do this, if technology continues to grow and expand. But anyway,
Yeah.
I just wanted to.
So, yeah, good questions and observations. Regarding the Nissan Leaf, back in my younger and more naive days when the Chevy Volt first came out, I thought, oh, this is great. And then you start looking at it. It's more expensive per gallon to power a car on electricity than it is gasoline. On top of that, if gasoline is so evil because of emissions, I mean, what are you replacing it with? Electricity, which is pretty similar. I guess if you went to wind and solar, then you can bridge that, that divide between transportation, fuel, and power plants. But as we see, even right now, with the most affordable energy sources we have, it's more expensive than gasoline. If you go to wind and solar power, now you're multiplying that times 3, 4, 5. On top of that, if you're going pure battery pack like the Leaf, it's got a range of about 40 miles and the charge time is a few hours. I mentioned I lived in Florida for 20 years. I had a golf cart. The federal government paid me to buy a golf cart to drive around my exurb subdivision. And I could drive for about 1 hour and then have to charge it overnight. It has very little utilitarian value. Maybe someday it'll come. Any of these technologies, hey, if solar power, wind power, if battery-powered cars would become competitive feasible, I'll cheer them on. I'll buy it myself. It's not that I have some, illogical, arbitrary hatred of this. I just want to make sure that, we're making our decisions based on proper information. Then regarding your second point, which was,
Solar power
oh
on the whole,
yeah, on the homes. So, first of all, if it cost him $45,000, the cost of that system, therefore, considering taxpayers pay 30% of that in subsidies up front, so that's now $60,000. And then if he took advantage of state and local subsidies, the true cost is going to be at least $65,000. It may have even been one of those programs specifically targeted by the federal government for subsidies and grants on top of the 30% across the board subsidies they hand out. Oftentimes they'll make the sales, they'll make all sorts of promises about how much electricity they're going to generate, how it's going to save them money, how the system's going to last forever. It's rarely true. When public buildings, because we can look at the actual documents or public records, there's a Hillsborough County Courthouse in Tampa, where I'm from. They put on this mega project, solar panels over the entire roof. They promised whatever their rate of electricity generation they promised, it's coming in less than half that. They're not even going to come close to getting their money back. They make all sorts of promises, even with the subsidized price that they're getting. And it's important to understand that the price that anyone pays for the equipment, you know, I bought the golf cart. I was like, boy, you know, do I want to be sticking to the taxpayers? But everyone else is doing it, and I have 2 daughters, and they love it. But the real price was not what I paid for it. It's what the subsidies and all that. And that's the same with the solar panels. Great questions.
Just one follow-up. Also this, I don't know if anybody else has considered home solar for their home, but if you sign a contract like that, you've got an extra loan on your house. And you have to take into consideration, your buyer, if you want to sell that house, which I'm gonna probably move into a nursing home in 10, 20 years, I'd have to sell the thing, and my buyer would have to take on that too.
And by the way, how many people have roofs that they expect to not need repair in 20 to 30 years? And then what do you do? That's another expense and another potential breach of contract. And yeesh. Yes, sir, in the back. I know you had your hand up for a while.
I have the data on my PC, which is here, as to the major variables that are affected by climate change. And I'd be happy to show it to anyone who wanted to look. You know, in some cases it goes back centuries, in other cases it only goes back to the beginning of the satellite era.
By variables affected by climate change, what specifically are you referring?
Global average temperature, sea level, Arctic sea ice, heat content of the upper ocean layer. Essentially, most of the data on which the global warming phenomenon is based. So, if people really want to look at data instead of opinion, it's here.
Yeah, and I'll just say, and I think it's good that everyone look at all sides of the data. When you say instead of opinion and do this to me, everything here in my slideshow was objective facts. When I present global warming presentations, they're objective sources and objective facts. So, for example, if you say that you have the temperature data, are you presenting, for example, the satellite instruments that measure the entirety of the atmosphere, or are you taking the thermometer readings after they've been adjusted by people who are already saying that we're facing a global warming crisis? So those are important things to keep in mind. So, I mean, and I respect the fact that you offer data, and so do I, and I think ultimately the truth will prevail. And I could be wrong. No one's right all the time. And that's why it's important to get all sides of the information and all sources of data. And I'll give you a follow-up.
Am I correct in my memory that the Heartland Institute was, for many years, for decades in fact, essentially supported by the tobacco industry to try to undermine what was then becoming clear that smoking had major negative health effects and was responsible for tens of thousands of deaths per year?
Yeah, sometimes people will see that. Yeah.
Oppose that tooth and nail with funding from the tobacco industry.
Right, so basically, oftentimes people will see something on a left-wing website, or they hear Al Gore say it, so it must be true. Our Heartland Institute funding, by the way, we were formed, our mission statement is we're a free market think tank. We search for free market solutions to the challenges and problems that influence society. Everything we do is towards that goal. There's nobody that's going to take us one way or the other. If we're chasing dollars from anybody, we'd be with the Environmental Defense Fund, we'd be with Greenpeace, we'd be with NRDC, whose budgets are 10 times what ours are. But regardless, getting to the point about tobacco funding, you can find on our website because we haven't sanitized anything from our website. To the extent that we have stuff on tobacco and smoking, what we have are links to peer-reviewed studies in the peer-reviewed literature that have been published by prestigious scientific journals. And what it relates to is secondhand smoke. We have never said, I know you might have had some environmental groups who say so, we have never said that smoking does not cause cancer, is not hazardous to your health. Everyone knows that, we know that, we've never said otherwise. So when we present links to peer-reviewed studies and say, hey, you might want to consider this, because when you look at the data, when you look at the studies that have been conducted by the federal government, by researchers, and what you find is that you have a very minimal increase in health effects for secondhand smoke, not nearly what the federal government says, much like in the global warming debate. Every day of the week, I'll come up here and point people to that and say, look at all sources of information, form your own conclusions. But to say that that somehow, therefore makes us nefarious, I disagree. But I respect your right to present it, but I hope you'll get better information next time.
One last question.
This gentleman had his hand up. Can we take two?
Sure.
All right, these two.
Why do rural co-ops get a break?
It varies some from state to state. Much of it's political. I hate to hold it against rural co-ops for getting a break because they're not being treated as badly as others. In New Mexico, your rural co-ops produce only 10% of the state's electricity. So the renewable power mandates are essentially for the public utilities.
See, in Phoenix area, the Salt River Project probably provides electricity for half of the people in Arizona.
Yeah, and they're a hoot though. We could talk about the Salt River Project that'd be a whole other topic, but they're politically connected. Yes, sir, in the white shirt.
Are you familiar with Section 111D of the Clean Air Act?
I sure am.
And do you believe that there's fraud in the carbon markets?
Fraud in the carbon. Okay, Section 111D is the the Obama administration's self-named Clean Power Plan. It requires a 30% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. Unlike past programs that apply a uniform standard across the nation, the EPA, has taken each individual state and say, you must cut 40%, you must cut 25%. I believe New Mexico is 32%, so more so than the rest of the nation. And those designations are arbitrary. The state of Washington produces fewer carbon dioxide emissions per person than any state in the nation, and yet they're required to reduce their emissions by 70+%. Now, is there fraud in the carbon markets? There certainly has been fraud in the carbon markets in Asia and in Europe, where they've had these programs in place much earlier and much more extensively here. In China in particular, basically you'd have these entities that would say, we propose, and they come up with the most energy-intensive, emissions-intensive project they can think of. We propose to do this, and we fully plan to build this. But if you pay us $50 million, we'll sell you $100 million worth of carbon emissions reduction certificates that then you could say you reduced emissions by this whole amount, when effectively nothing happened. You just gave money to some entity that formed on paper only.
So how do you propose to prevent fraud in carbon markets?
If you're going to have markets, and markets, if you must have these expensive, big government, intrusive carbon dioxide restrictions, utilizing markets, in theory, is better than just a top-down mandate from EPA. But of course, anytime you have this captive, arbitrary, artificial market, then you have these problems. How do you prevent fraud? It's very difficult to do. I don't have any specific solutions. I know there are folks who have studied it. In California, they had an issue with their can returns. So you have the deposits on cans in California. They'd take any cans. They'd basically get them from Nevada, bring them to California, and make money off of it. Those types of things. I don't know, but it's a good concern that much of these emissions reductions that have been promised, that have been reported, simply aren't occurring. Now that doesn't bother me from an environmental standpoint, because I don't think carbon dioxide is a problem. I think its nets are beneficial rather than harmful, but it is a travesty that it's going to cost our economy so much money for these programs that are filled with scams where they've been tried. Anyway, if anyone wants to ask questions, talk afterwards, I'm happy to. Thank you so much for giving up your evening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, James. Thanks for coming out. And if you want to get an idea, I thought of when you were talking about the rats, is that anyone who goes to the gym, you would think that they could put generators on the treadmills, and that would be another way to do it. But even that is not plausible. And actually, you have to plug in the treadmill at the gym, so it's actually costing energy. So anyway, good discussion, enjoyed it, thank you very much. And we will have these on our website, riograndefoundation.org, in a matter of days.
Excellent. Fantastic.
You know that, when you're elected,
Unemployment, everybody mentions how nice it is.
Is that for individuals? Because businesses, I think, pay lower rate. Are you? Okay, go ahead.
Horrible church pushing at its nasty bomb.
Oh, those life.
they're kind of like the water. And they run the diminish, but I'm looking, I got a guy.
Dropping by 67%.
And they're very much, they're getting attention to that 30-inch.
It's amazing what we
And it's more PRC. The main bad guy was Jason.
Right. Well, he was. He's no longer there. But unfortunately, too many.
He has a good approach, it's easy to work, except for the
He's a nice man. He is not as corrupt as a lot of the PRC folks have been. But he is definitely a true believer on the policies.
tell him let him have a 10.
Well, thanks for coming out.
Thank you for the presentation.
As a mining engineer,